Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. My name is Martin Graham, and I am the training manager at NQA. I'm just going to wait just another minute or so to see if there's any more attendees joining. We've got quite a few joining us this afternoon. So I'm just going to begin the introductions and then we'll start the webinar proper. A quick bit of housekeeping for you. Hopefully you can all hear me, and on your screen you should see a box that you can type questions into. If you can't hear me, then let me know now or at any point, and I will get some technical help and support so that we can carry on the webinar. Within that questions box, you can obviously ask questions as we're going along, but as there's obviously quite a few of you, I realise that could get quite busy. So what we'll do, I'll let those build up, and then at the end, I'll answer them in groups. And if there is a significant number, we'll do a questions and answers session that we can issue out to all of you in due course. But feel free to kind of make notes as you're going along. You will get a copy of this presentation sent out to you from the marketing team. So anything that you feel free to make your own notes, and likewise any questions towards the end. That's the housekeeping side of things. I've not had any people notify me they can't hear me, so we'll begin and see how we go along. Okay. Start at the beginning. What is risk? I think we've heard of this term time and time again, certainly within our ISO audits and certainly me as through my auditing life. And fundamentally, the basic principle or definition within ISO is described as the effect of uncertainty. And obviously, that uncertainty can be around any part of what you do and any part of your business or your management system. But that's where it's getting at. Obviously, within the context of your management system, that really boils down to risks associated with achieving your intended results, enhancing your desirable effects and preventing undesirable effects and achieving improvements. So basically, really what that's asking you to do is look at the risks associated with not realising what your intended outcomes are, what you're trying to achieve, be it your policy or your objectives or customer satisfaction and so on. So it's what's uncertain about what you're doing within your organisation. It's not a new concept. It's been renamed risk within ISO, but obviously those of you who've had certification for a while, and I certainly remember it. Remember this principle of preventative action. It was right at the very end of the standard, and basically it was never really implemented or audited effectively. So what the ISO committee did, they essentially they moved the whole thing around and put it at the front of the standard and introduced it to a whole new principle. But fundamentally, it's this idea of preventing something going wrong, being proactive about your management system and risk. Where does risk occur and uncertainty? I mean, typically, when I'm on assessments and talking about these things with people, you find that it's typically around people, be it their training, their awareness, or their understanding of something, or humans being humans. It could be the process. The process itself may be flawed or ineffective or miscommunicated. There could be uncertainty around the product itself with regards to compliance or some form of product conformity, be it customer requirements or an internal specification. And then there's infrastructure and environment risks as well. You've got any number of variables there, be it physical or people's environment and so on. So there's any number of factors. That's obviously not an exhaustive list, but it's kind of the key areas that I come across when I'm auditing. So these areas that you need to consider when it comes to risk. Fundamentally, if you identify the uncertainty and address that, you by definition then you are addressing the risk. So it's not something to necessarily overthink. It's quite a simple concept. It is risk, but I think sometimes it can get a little bit overthought. And one of the tricks is trying to interpret what you're already doing and applying it to standard and how that applies to risk-based thinking. It can apply to any management system, obviously with the NXSL standard structure that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The ISO standards are following this common structure now, and they all have this idea and this principle of risk-based thinking. But obviously there is a distinct, well not a distinct, but there's a different distinction between health and safety risk and aspects and impacts and the risks associated with management system risks. It's obviously that remains, and those things are still valid. But what the standards are asking you to do is look at the ultimate risks associated with the management system, and not necessarily your health or safety or hazards, and indeed your aspects and impacts, although they do cross over. Fundamentally, keeping it simple and plain English is basically what is in doubt that could affect what we do, and that's you as an organisation. So that's what you need to determine. Types of risk, we've already mentioned some of them, as we've already said there. There can be financial risks, obviously we're all exposed to those in one form or another. Compliance risks, so that's obviously largely from a health and safety or potentially environmental perspective, but obviously also you've got compliance associated with a product conformity or something like that that needs to be considered. You've got human risks, naturally. Obviously, we've all got our ways of acting and the variables that happen in our lives. So obviously, these uncertainties need to be proactively identified as reasonably practical as you can. The environment and health and safety, obviously there's ultimate variables there, but there are risks associated with that outside of hazards and aspects and impacts. So it's something that does need to be considered. Risks associated with your perception, how you're perceived as a business. You've obviously got, there's sensitive things going on at the moment commercially and so on. It's kind of, you've got to consider how they can affect you as a business and your processes. Operational, obviously that's a big area. Operationally, there's any number of variables. As we said previously, it can be the people, the infrastructure, the communication, people's understanding of what their actual job is, the equipment they're using, whatever it may be. And lastly, not leastly, think about the infrastructure. So you've got things like housekeeping and obviously maintenance and so on. There's various things that come into play when you've got to think about what's uncertain about what you're doing. The effect of uncertainty on uncertainty that it affects. It's an unusual kind of sentence to get your head around, but basically risk within ISO is defined as the former. So we're looking at the effect of uncertainty. But obviously, if you've got an uncertainty within business, and that ultimately can affect you, that could be defined as a risk itself. Whatever way you decide to fall on it, risk is involved and the output's the same, i.e. you have to determine what needs to be actioned and what actions you're going to take and how effective they are. Naturally, action to address a risk typically addresses an uncertainty, so they do go hand in hand. Basically, the standards now, they all talk about this idea of context. So, and I always use the term relevance, basically, when you set up a management system, keep everything in context, keep it relevant. So basically, whatever you're looking at, whatever risks you're thinking about or you feel you've determined, make sure they remain relevant to you, because otherwise they start to lose their value and it becomes a bit of a question mark for you, and it becomes harder to, once you take things out of context, it becomes harder to actually keep things, value added, and you're struggling for ideas rather than looking for what actually can add value to you as a business. So risk-based thinking, obviously it's implicit now within all the standards. I'm sure you've all been spoken to death about it with your auditors and discussed it and so on, but kind of what does it actually kind of allude to and require that you do? Basically, the idea is that you have risk-based thinking across everything that you do as an organisation. It should be systematic and not kind of a standalone one person doing it because they're responsible for the management system, whatever it may be. It should be this idea that everyone can get involved, and indeed should, because obviously the more people who are involved, it spreads the load, and you can get different feedback from people from their own working practices and experience. So get people involved in things. It can exist in any part of the system, process, functions, and should be considered at each stage. So that could be anything right through from marketing, right through to commercial, through sales, programming, purchasing, training, calibration, after sales, delivery. Every part of the business can have a degree of uncertainty associated with it. And the standards now asking you to look at each of those functions within the business, look at where you can go wrong, what can trip you up, and what you can do to prevent that from happening. Obviously, not all processes carry or will be exposed to the same level of risk. It may be that, within your own organisation, function carries very little weight and is a small part of the process. And obviously, other parts may be more exposed to that. If you're in an engineering or fabrication, it may be the kind of procurement and calibration are very, very high on the agenda, obviously, because of the impact that they can have. But something like maybe marketing, it may not necessarily be as exposed as it needs to be. So consider all of those things and the relevance and the weight the processes carry. Identifying risk should be proactive rather than reactive. Obviously, it's that idea again I mentioned earlier, this idea of preventative action. It's do something before it happens. I think we've all kind of heard the idea of corrective action and preventative action. basically the idea of risk-based thinking is that you look for things before they happen. Think of a risk assessment, it's assessing something and making sure you can do something proactive about preventing that from happening. It's integral to everyday life, essentially. Recognising and applying this is important. It's the key thing. And like I said earlier, one of the biggest tricks with a management system, and I always say to people when I'm audits, is, chances are you're going to be doing the very best part of this anyway, just part and parcel of running your business. Getting up, we don't get up in the morning and hope for the best. There's a degree of planning and everything that goes in. The idea is to integrate that and recognise that within your management system. And the chances are, if an auditor asks a question, some of them like to see bits of paper and things written down, but obviously, ultimately, if you can demonstrate the way that you're doing it and it's valid and in compliance with the standard, it's whatever format you take that it really be that a risk assessment, be it just an explanation or meetings or whatever it may be, but it can exist in various formats. So don't feel like you've got to present a risk assessment with severity and likelihood. It can be in that way, but obviously, have your own way of approaching it. Further on from this idea, risk-based thinking is not only negative. Obviously, you think of competition and expansion within your organisation. Yes, that's a risk, and it obviously has its uncertainties and question marks around it. But obviously, they can produce positive effects and opportunities, such as obviously like improvements in efficiency and planning, growth in resources, upskilling, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. So the standards do talk about the clause is actually called risk and opportunity. So they do go hand in hand. There's you should look for the positive in things as well. So don't think of it as a negative process, certainly. Risk-based thinking, it will allow you to consider current situation and the possibilities for an impact of change. So another clause was introduced in the standard, certainly the 2015 standards, was this idea of management of change. So kind of having your handle on things, and obviously where there is change, there can be uncertainties associated with that. So it's another element of risk that you can build into your business. Some risks, as with most things in life, that they can be acceptable or tolerable to some degree. So really, you don't want to over-engineer an action and come up with a solution that really kind of inhibits you or prevents you from doing something that you need to do. You don't want to wrap yourself up in cotton wool and not be able to progress your business and grow as it needs to. So think about things, risks will vary according to organisation, as I've said, and the relevance and the context. What you see being done elsewhere may not be relevant to you. So don't feel during an audit that you expect to do something. As long as you assessed it and can demonstrate to the auditor that you've looked at it, and understood it and considered it and evaluated it, we're happy to accept that. Ultimately, it is about the risks of and associated with achieving the objectives of the management system. That's really what the crux of all this is. And when you think about what you're trying to achieve as part of your certification, obviously naturally I would imagine certainly a chunk of you is the commercial element. Obviously certification has with it the advantages and so on. But obviously ultimately it's down to kind of conformity of products and services and achieving the intended outcomes. And the intended outcomes, when you think of what your policy statement sits around, it's about improvement and customer satisfaction and compliance and so on. So really it's about looking at the risks associated with achieving all of those, bring those into play when you're thinking this, applying your risk-based ideas. Remember the context, keep things relevant, absolutely, and it's not a new idea. It's something. The chances are, and I do mean this, is something that you're doing already, and it's not a new concept. Just recognise that it's a big part of what you do. As I've already mentioned there, it's all relative, so do keep things consistent and contextual with what you're doing. Keep it simple. It's a common phrase, we all use it, but keep it simple. Don't overthink things. If you've kind of exhausted all you can think of, chances are that's maybe all that's there, and go with that, and then see what happens over time. Involvement of people, I mentioned that's a key thing that when I'm on audits as well, I was kind of if I'm not seeing it, I usually raise it as an observation or opportunity for improvement, get people involved, the people actually undertaking the process or responsible for the function. They have the best ideas of kind of how they're working and what can affect them and the uncertainties and risks associated with what they do. So get people involved. They will answer. They're involved during the audit, so they won't necessarily get challenged, but it's nice to see consistency when you're talking to different departments, that's fed through to the top management team and that they're engaging with the workforce. Think about what issues can affect your organisation's values. We mentioned earlier about perception, so obviously you put the organisation's performance, perception, and knowledge, and how they can affect your objectives. You obviously will have objectives set around the management system and performance and so on. So think about how they can be kind of reverse engineered, if you like, through to uncertainties and risks, and how you can address that. What actions do you take once you've carried out your risk-based thinking? What do you do? I mean, obviously, it's you can avoid the thing entirely. You can eliminate, substitute. We've got this idea of hierarchy of controls and so on with health and safety. Similar kind of things can carry on with quality, environmental, or any other standard. Indeed, it's basically about kind of determining what you want to do, and that level of action. Standards, all they ask for is that you determine the risk, take appropriate action. It's where needed. So it's down to you to kind of qualify the action, determine it, and then ultimately review how effective that's been, whether or not it's been a worthwhile process. So keep things relevant. It's relative to the scale of what you are and who you are and what you do, but also the size and scale of the problem or risk itself. It won't always be the same action that's required for each risk. As I said there, keep things in context and proportionate. Don't over-engineer and over-rig the custodians. Otherwise, you can tie yourself up in knots, and it can be problematic for you. Preventative action, mentioned it already. It's not necessarily gone. The principle's there, and if you prefer it, the terminology, the standards use the term risk and so on. But if you prefer the use of preventative action, if people understand that idea a bit better, then that's absolutely right. I think people tend to default to, when they hear risk, they instinctively kind of go to health and safety risk and so on, which obviously is not necessarily a bad thing, but we're thinking here about kind of system risk and operational and the process risk. Risk-based thinking, what it fundamentally does is enable an organisation to determine any factors that could cause its process and its management system to deviate from planned results, and basically to put in place preventative controls to minimise negative effects and to maximise use of opportunities. Keeping that, boiling that down to kind of something that's simple is basically what are you trying to achieve? What are you planning on, being that resource development, infrastructure development, business growth, whatever it may be. Think about all these things. Methodology, there's no real correct methodology. It's I mentioned there previously about this idea of risk assessments, and we've all seen, I'm sure, likelihood and severity tables with red, amber and greens. There's any kind of number of methodologies that you can use. It can just be a discussion with the relevant members of staff and workers and so on, and there's not a right or wrong way of doing it. It's whatever works for you. Obviously, the uncertainties, even once you determine them, they will arguably always be there, but obviously what you can do is manage the effects, and that's really what the standard asks for, so you don't just, you're proactive in looking for these things, addressing the issues as things go along. When you're looking at risks and kind of looking at the processes and so on, look at the failure points. If you look at a process, be it purchasing, procurement, for example, you think of the failure points within that process. It could be something as simple as a non-approved supplier being used. It could be the contractor or the supplier's not got the correct qualifications or experience. It could be that purchase orders could be missed. It could be that once the incorrect items delivered, that it's not received correctly or checked or verified. So if there's any kind of, we think of that as a simple kind of process. Procurements, that's an example of a process, but it could be anything from design through to marketing, training. Everything's got some kind of uncertainty associated with it. So just kind of think about where you can trip up, where you can fall down, and how you want to address that. As I mentioned before, obviously, broader resources, the more people you've got involved, the more eyes and ears and thoughts and brains and so on you've got going into the whole thing. It could be something that, and also as well, we've got other people involved looking into different departments or areas, just because someone's working in it, they're doing it, but I've been into different parts of a business and you look over their shoulder and it's like, why are you doing that? And it's just, well, I've always done it that way. But that's one of the nice things about third-party auditing. You could look at things kind of objectively and take a stance on that. But obviously, you can do that in your own business as well. Get different people from different departments looking at each other, and getting them to suggest and map things out. And obviously, it's a bit of time and resource, but you might get people putting their hand up and saying, oh yeah, it takes me forever to get that from bobbing stores, but ultimately if it was done this way, then it could save us all a lot of time further down the line. So look at your processing efficiencies and uncertainties and so on. One step at a time, don't rush it. Obviously look at what you're doing, who you are and who you do it for, and look at all the processes and the risks associated with that. Joined up thinking, it's a term I use quite often during internally at NQA and indeed on audits as well. It's, kind of don't have risks and don't have the system sitting alone, and make sure it is integral to kind of everything that you do. Otherwise it becomes very difficult to manage and kind of keep compliant with, and difficult to audit as well. And it's when things are disjointed, they don't necessarily flow, but it all kind of comes back to this idea of context, keeping things relevant. Documentation, obviously some standards, certainly there's a little bit of disconnect here with the standards. 9001 doesn't say that you have to document your risks. 14001 talks about documenting the ones that need to be addressed. 45,001, you have to document essentially kind of all of them, as well as obviously the health and safety risks. So obviously if you operate an integrated system, chances are there could be integrated risks and you find yourself documenting the entire thing. But obviously for a 9001 system, if it's a relatively small business, 1, 2, 3 people, you might not want a big list of things written down because it's not necessarily relevant or used to you. So read what the standard's asking for, and obviously you can talk with the auditor about it at the time, but obviously keep things relevant and make sure that it's the documentation essentially backs up the conclusions that you're coming to. As we've already said earlier, kind of addressing risks and identifying opportunities. Simple one there, we've already spoken about procurement. So a risk around the suppliers, be that the type or quantity of suppliers, it may actually lead you to kind of going outside the circle of trust and saying, oh, okay, let's source someone else. It may turn out to be a better option for you. So this isn't a negative process, any of this. No, risk and auditing's got a bit of a stigma attached to it, but ultimately it's meant to be a positive and value-added process. Uncertainty in everything that we do. It's essentially kind of, it's everything that we do. There's uncertainty about getting up and going to work in the morning and going to bed at night. But obviously identifying this, where that exists, and evaluating the effect and determining action is essentially the fundamental concept of risk-based thinking. So that's all the standards asking you to do, is look at where you are in the business, what it's doing, where it can go wrong, and then action that. And that's really what we're looking for when we're auditing. So you talk about the possible effects of uncertainty. There's any numbers. This isn't the finite list. Obviously, you will get copies of all this, so I won't read all these out. But you can see some of the, as I bring these up, you can see some of the areas of uncertainty and what's the effects of uncertainty, and arguably therefore risks that could be associated with any kind of any business that we're involved in or business that you run. So there were any number of things there. As I say, this isn't an absolute list, but it's kind of some of the areas that can be considered uncertainties, and that you start to consider as part of your organisation. There, some have already spoken about supply chains, obviously. Succession, that's obviously a big one nowadays. Knowledge and so on. Obviously, compliance, anything like that at all. Obviously, change, uncontrolled change, that's a big thing, kind of things being introduced within business that haven't been kind of gone through the correct process of check and measure. It can all, inefficiencies, if there's any number of things, they're obviously listed there, but you can, that they may or may not, some may or none of them may not apply to you as a business, but you have your own ways and means of thinking. So what do we get out of this? Obviously, apart from if we've got on the wall that you're compliant and you're addressing these ideas, what can we achieve? Improved likelihood of achieving objectives. Obviously, if you're looking at the uncertainties associated with that, by definition, you're more likely to achieve them. Consistency of output. Obviously, if you're looking after resources and supply chain and infrastructure and everything that goes with it, chances are, you're going to achieve a consistency of output that is potentially higher. Ultimately, confidence in the system and the deliverables, what you're trying to achieve. Obviously, in terms of deliverables, that means obviously system deliverables as well as product and client-related issues. You can arguably, with this, there's a big switch now to kind of communication and engagement and so on, and it can lead to this idea of establishing a proactive culture of improvement. So people feel kind of, if you like, added value to the whole thing and more involved and integrated. Obviously, there needs to be leadership there, and it's fundamentally where it sits. But getting people involved and getting people that culture shift was the whole things. It can also assist naturally with obviously audit compliance, absolutely, because it's a requirement within the standards. And then that, statutory and regulatory compliance. So you look at where your failure points could be, within the environmental system. It could be, again, awareness is a simple one. We've all come across transfer notes and people saying, oh, I didn't necessarily know that even needed to be there. There's an uncertainty there associated with people's knowledge that ultimately can lead to a compliance issue from a regulatory perspective. Operational efficiency and governance, so you can start to kind of look at where things are, where the gaps are in the system, and where they could be they could potentially be filled. Change management, obviously we mentioned that previously. So again, things change, obviously they do, regardless of what we all want or like. I think things change, but it's how you kind of address and look at uncertainties and risks associated with that, and that's what we're looking for in auditing is, okay, that's happened, but what did you do? How did you evaluate? How was that considered as part of your quality and system control? Going on a bit further, there's even more, if you can imagine that. Enhancing your knowledge base, like we said there, kind of that's a good thing that I mentioned earlier about succession planning, knowledge within the business. Obviously, we've all got our roles and responsibilities that we know and function within the business, but arguably, you don't want it so that one person at the equation, leaves a big gap. We look at that when we audit, we look at the process rather than individuals. So we're looking for that process control and have you kind of addressed the uncertainties associated with either not having an individual there or if that process fails, whatever it may be. Perception, mentioned that a couple of times now. Obviously, stakeholder perception. We've all heard of the clause of, or hopefully, interested parties. So ultimately, they're essentially stakeholders within the business. They've got an interest in what you do, and they've got needs and expectations. So look at how you may not be realising those or recognising those. So again, it's uncertainty within what you're trying to achieve. System and operational resilience. If you're more efficient and more people know what they're doing and it's more consistent, chances are, it's not an absolute, but the chances are that you can become the process can be more effective and arguably stronger. Total management system effectiveness there. Arguably, kind of boiling down to the principles of it, preventing negative effects. It's arguably, none of us want things to go wrong, but they do. It's kind of how proactive you are in recognising and addressing those. And ultimately as well, reliability of products and services, a bit of consistency there. So, going on to kind of how this relates a little bit to the whole Plan, Do, Check, Act and relevant or applicable clauses to the standard there. Obviously, clause 4, I think hopefully you're all familiar with the Annex SL standard. Clauses 1 to 10, essentially the requirements start at clause 4. So basically, clause 4 there, determine the management system exposed to risk. So set up a system, look at what you need to address and areas that you need to concern yourself with when it comes to risk. Clause 5, obviously something that we do get do kind of challenge quite not severely, but certainly we do look for it. Absolutely, it's top management kind of engaging with the whole thing. It's idea of promoting the system and providing resources and so on. So we will ask kind of that the management get involved, top management that is. Clause 6 is where the actual requirements sit, essentially identifying the risks and taking action. Obviously, once you've done all of this, you need to resource it, and that's kind of really where the whole thing sits in terms of the doing side of things and the planning. Manage the operational processes in line with clause 6. So this is kind of where the whole thing sits into play. So this is where the actions, if you like, once you've taken an action or determined an action, you put it into play within clause 8 and actually make it take effect and obviously make people aware of things and what they should and shouldn't be doing. Going on to clause 9. This is where this is the checking side of things. So, okay, we've identified something, we've taken an action. How effective has it been? Do we need to change it? Do we need to rethink the whole thing? Has it gone as far as it can go? And can we move on? There's obviously various outcomes from taking an action. Clause 10, basically, that's kind of, boils down to kind of, the improvement side of things, which is a mandatory requirement, continuing improvement. And that's where you're asked to kind of address the undesired effects and update your risks and improve. So that's the acting side of things. And hopefully, to some degree, it goes round in a nice kind of circle that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the whole Plan, Do, Check, Act side of things. So planning obviously involving leadership, identifying and assessing the actions and risks and so on. Implementing things, communicate, obviously that's key. It's no good having, one person trying, keep the lid on, a 100-person company. Obviously, yes, they can oversee that, but ultimately it's down to getting other individuals involved with, take, identifying risks, but also actually involving them with the actions as well. Obviously, checking, monitoring, making sure you're doing, doing what you suggested you want to do, and then obviously implement any changes and how effective that whole thing has been. Within risk-based thinking, obviously the idea of a management program, keeping it simple. There's kind of 5 steps to this. It's basically identify, analyze, treat, monitor, and control. Very, very simple concepts. Obviously, the trick here is applying these to how your organisations work and how they're structured and the functions that you've got. So basically, applying those kind of 5 principles, if you like, program steps, A, to the business as a whole, but then secondly to the actual individual functions and processes. Methodologies, we mentioned this earlier on. Obviously, there's quite a few. This is 7 or 8 or so of a few of them. SWOTs, I'm sure you've all kind of heard of that. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's quite effective. Sometimes when I do an audit, so I'll talk about these things, but they ultimately lead to then further discussion about where are we looking at it from a risk-based thinking. PESTLE, similar kind of things. Obviously, that takes into consideration political, environmental, social, technological, legal and economic criteria, and looking at the uncertainties associated with them. Obviously, you've got a few things here. You've got external and internal factors, so there will be things externally, there's certain political situations, obviously, that can affect you, but what can you really do about that? You can plan as best you can, but obviously the internal issues could arguably be a little bit more manageable and a bit more kind of realistic for you. FMEA, failure mode effect analysis, obviously an automotive term, but arguably, it looks into the ideas, the failure points that I mentioned earlier on in the process. 31001, it's a risk-based thinking standard. Obviously, some of you may be aware of that. There's things that you can adopt, principles you can adopt in that. Cause and effect, brainstorming, as we mentioned earlier, kind of getting people involved, interview with various personnel, and root cause analysis, ultimately can all lead to various positive determination of risks. So, putting it kind of very, very simply, the way I kind of always say to people is kind of, so when I'm talking to people, I say, look, what is uncertain around what you are trying to achieve, and what can affect, and how can you manage it? So essentially, it's ask yourself the question, and the people within your organisation, what are we actually kind of trying to achieve here with our management system? And it's obviously people have different ideas about that. There'll be compliance, there'll obviously be performance and improvement and customer focus and earning money. Obviously, that's in there somewhere along the line. But ultimately, it's about kind of, okay, how can we not do this? What are the holes that we can go down? What can trip us up? And let's be proactive about that. And you don't need to get too granular about it, but you can certainly certainly look at the processes of what you're doing, break the company, the organisation down into the various steps, and look at what's uncertain there, and obviously when it comes to health and safety, environmental, or any other standards, it's looking at what can trip you up here. And usually, if you're looking at the people, the infrastructure, the process, and the environment that they're in, look at the gaps or the potential gaps, and see what you can achieve. And hopefully, somewhere along the line, certainly you'll be able to demonstrate some compliance to NQA and your auditors, but ultimately it should really be about kind of improving as well. And hopefully that's where you'll end up. That's obviously half an hour is not necessarily a long time to talk about risk. It's a big subject area, and it is an area that as an entity, NQA, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning there, I'm a training manager, and one of the areas we're looking at over the next certainly the next certainly for 2020 is this idea of risk-based thinking training, and it's an area that we're developing some training tools on that we'll be able to come in-house and deliver this kind of thing to clients. And it can be a 1 day, 2 day kind of thing, so you keep an eye out for that. Obviously, there's various means of keeping in touch. We will do that via our the newsletters and so on and so forth, and then hopefully it's been of value. Obviously, it's a big topic. I know it's an unusual area, and there's always questions about it. Hopefully that's been of some value, and if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to. I'll stay online for a period of time. I'm more than happy to see those on the screen. Failing that, I will kind of collate them as best I can to form a question and answer that we can get some kind of, there's some themes coming through. More than happy to do that. So thank you for listening. I'll keep the chat open for a while now, and keep my eyes open, and hopefully there's been of use, and probably do one of these another again soon. They've been very popular. There's kind of nearly 200 people this time, and about 200 or so last time. So obviously it's an area that people are interested in. So thanks for listening, and enjoy your weekends. Thanks. Bye now.